Yeah, so I'm at, my Twitter handle's at the bottom left. If you can follow me, that'd be amazing, because I'm trying to beat somebody else. I promised I'd beat him to 1,000, and that's kind of where I'm going with. I've been working with Magento for 6 years now in an agency as a consultant in lots of different contexts, to be honest. And over those years, I've sort of realised that, you know, the command line is something that, unlike Magento, there's no certifications for, there's no study guide, there's no strict way to learn. So I thought I'd put together some of the things I've learned over the years that have saved me a lot of time, and if, you know, just one thing you take away from this saves you seconds every day, I think it's probably worth hearing me talk for 15 minutes about it anyway. So let's start with SSH. Obviously SSH is used to connect to remote servers, such as, you know, your client's development environments, stage environments, and so on. If you do need to flip between those connections quite quickly, it can be quite useful to make use of what is called an SSH Config file. Now, your SSH Config file looks something like this. So typically, you type an SSH command and you'd have to manually specify the port, the user, the remote IP, and maybe even lots of different private keys depending on where your different clients are hosted. If you specify an SSH config file, typing those SSH commands to connect to remote servers becomes quite as easy as just typing SSH and then the name you specified right at the top there. You put it in .sh/config in your home directory, and it's as simple as that, really. Another useful thing with SSH is to use screen. Now, what is screen? If you've ever decided that, you know, you're going to deploy something or connect to a remote server in a you know, somewhere with poor network connection, or maybe, like Phil said earlier, you're all on tour with your band and you're in your band's truck and, you know, you're connecting over your phone or whatever. That connection can be a bit fragile. So any processes you start with in that SSH connection are as vulnerable as that SSH connection. They're as vulnerable as your network connection. So what you want to do is decouple those processes from the actual SSH connection itself. And Screen allows you to do that. Screen allows you to create virtual terminals that are disconnected from your actual network connection. So let's look at how you use Screen. Screen, there's my little cheat sheet, because I actually literally have that written down. If you want to create a new screen, you want to create a new virtual terminal, it's simple as screen-s and you specify a name. It can be quite useful to name that, you know, similar to what process you intend on running within that screen session, for example, a database dump or a database import. If you want to detach that screen and leave whatever process you've got within that screen running, it's as simple as Control A and D, and that will resume your normal SSH session. At some point, you might think, and let's skip down to this one here, you might think, you know, what screens have I got running in the background? Maybe I've got a few of them. Screen-ls, obviously analogous to the ls command that you'll run to view files, will show you what screens you've got available, and if you want to resume them, you specify with screen-r to go back to the named screen you've specified previously. I, to be honest, don't use the top stuff that often. I'm a bit lazy, so I use the bottom one, which basically says connect me to a screen if a screen exists, and if a screen doesn't exist, create me a new screen and access that one. This can be really useful if you're, like I say, using poor network connection, or you just want to be safe with your client's production server. So let's talk about another thing, and that is escaping a dead SSH connection. You might find that if you're using a terminal and your network connection does drop, again, all my tips seem to be around deployments in pubs. I don't always deploy in pubs, but if you do lose your connection when you're deploying in a pub, you'll find that your terminal dies and you're actually pressing keys and nothing's happening. That can be quite frustrating, and you could open up a new tab and close it again, but a quicker way is just to press the command enter_. Enter tilde is known as a sort of a SSH escape sequence, and as soon as you press enter tilde, it takes you into what is effectively a sort of a non-SSH context to interface with your terminal more generally. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Let's move away from SSH and let's talk about file manipulation. I think we all know, you know, the basics like CD and how to ls, etc. But I know that a lot of us, including me sometimes, do something like that. And what you'll do is you go along, you sort of tab the directory and you'll keep tabbing, and what tab will do is bring up, you know, say I press CD code, I'm tabbing, it's going to give me all my my vendors, it's going to list them right in front of me, I can type that at autocomplete, that's brilliant. But what you're losing out on is the opportunity to do that, because CD keeps at least one directory in memory at one time. So if you do that, there's no way you can quickly go back to the root. So for example, in Magento, you might want to go all the way to that etc directory, maybe check permissions on the env or the config.php file, what have you. And then you might think, right, I need to go immediately back to the root now. So it's quite useful to bear that functionality in mind. Let's talk about tar. Tar is archiving and compression. I'm pretty sure we'll have all come across tar in some context or another. But for me, I've always struggled with, what the actual command line arguments are with tar. Even up until I actually learned this next bit. But if we just review what they are, czf is going to create as a new tar directory. In that example, myarchive.tar.gzip. And then anything I type where the files is there is obviously going to be put into that tarball. C stands for create new archive, zip, and then F means the next thing I'm going to type is going to be the file name for that tarball. But I've got quite an embarrassing way of remembering it. And everyone says, this thing isn't really a pirate thing, Matt, but I always think of it as a pirate. But it is literally, forget what it means. It creates your files. That's what you want to do. You want to create a tarball. It creates your files. It's always going to be that for me. Until I actually prepared this presentation, I forgot what they actually originally meant. Analogously, you've got to extract your files. I thought you were doing that. This is probably the most useful thing I've got to say. We may as well stop now, to be honest. But while we're on tar, let's think about what else is useful. Notice I've ignored the Z. You don't actually need the Z when you extract it. It can auto-detect that, but for the sake of the mnemonic, it's worth doing. If you want to, say, not actually extract that tarball to your current directory, you want to specify a different directory for that to go to, -C in the top. Or if you remember in Magento 1, when you downloaded the folder, the tarball, it would actually put the Magento directory inside of the Magento tarball, and that was quite annoying because I'd end up with folders called Magento. So it's quite useful to know that I can just specify Magento at the end, and that's actually going to take that Magento folder's contents out and put them where I intend it to put it, maybe in combination with that -C command up there. Mkdir, quite simple. Make a directory. Quite familiar with that, hopefully. But what a lot of people don't know is the -P command. So while typically you might do something similar to above, or maybe you'll do them one line at a time, what you can just do is save yourself a lot of time and put that all in one line at one point. You can go a step further than that, and you can actually create multiple directories at the same time, still using the -P command by using the curly braces to sort of break that apart. And you can see that I've created this directory structure just by that one line. Now, you might think, I don't need that, it's a bit too verbose, but that's going to make sort of bash scripts a lot easier to read if you need to do something in bulk. At the bottom here, I've obviously displayed the tree structure that's going to be the output of that mkdir command, and that tree structure in itself is quite useful, and that comes from a command called tree. Tree isn't native on most operating systems, but I don't think it is native on any, but you can install it using a thing called Homebrew on a Mac, or apt-get on Ubuntu and YUML on CentOS and so on, and whatever your package manager is for your operating system, it's there. And tree will print out the whole thing. Now, tree can get a little bit cumbersome. You can imagine running tree on a Magento code base, that's going to absolutely, spam standard out. However, what you can do with trees, you can specify a -n parameter, and that's going to let you specify the depth. It might be -d. I'll come back to you on that one. So another useful thing is keeping an eye on files. Say, for example, you've got a log file, you've got an access log, you've got an error log, and you're wanting to, make a request on the front end and see how that changes that file. There's a program called Less. I think Less is another one that's quite popular, but it's useful to know that if you are in Less, you can press Shift and F, and that's going to hook you onto the bottom of that file. So any messages or any additional lines that get added to that file are going to be updated onto the terminal in real time. You can also achieve a similar thing with a command called tail. Tail on its own will just print out the last 10 lines of any file, which is quite useful in its own right. But if you want to have a similar thing to the previous slide, where you're just hooking onto the bottom of it, there's a -F command that's going to continuously give you the last few lines of that file. And you can specify another command line parameter -n to specify exactly how many lines you want. More generically than that, it's quite useful to be able to keep an eye on files whenever they're updated. But another command I find quite useful is watch. Now, watch can actually, again, it's not native, you need to use the appropriate package manager to install it, but watch can run any command on any interval. So if, say, for example, I wanted to reproduce the output of the previous commands I've just mentioned, it's as simple as watch every second I want to, cat out or print out the value of that file. What it can also do, like I said, as it's more generic, is it can print out ls, and it can keep going and telling me as soon as a file arrives in my operating system, which can be quite useful if I'm waiting for immediately for like an FTP input. I've known some really dodgy deployments done with watch, where they'll put watch to every second to do a git pull inside of a screen. So I'm not teaching you screen and watch to do dodgy deployments. But it is useful. So these are some of the file-based commands that I find quite useful. I think grep's a well-known one used for searching files. Sed can do find and replace, much more stuff. And oak, it deserves a talk on its own because that's a much more complex text manipulation language. So let's talk about processes. Obviously, if you run a process, it can be quite useful to actually keep what that process is printing quiet and push it to the background. If you want to run a process in the background, you put an ampersand at the end of the command, and that's going to give you initially a process ID, and then shut up and let you carry on using your terminal, which is quite useful. If you run a command called jobs, that will give you a list of jobs that you've pushed into the background. What's worth noting though is if you do have a task in the background, that's still going to continue pushing its output to standard out. So that can sort of get in the way, be a bit annoying, but it will still inform you when it's done and when that process is finished. But a lot of the time I forget when, that I want to run this in the background, or maybe I start running the program and I think, I wish I had run that in the background because it's taken a bit longer to execute than I initially anticipated. So if I forget to do it, all I need to do is press Ctrl and Z once I've started running the program. What Ctrl and Z will do is it'll actually suspend the process. It won't put it in the background initially, so you need to follow the Ctrl Z by a BG. Typing the BG command will take your suspended process and it'll put it into the background. Once it's put it into the background, analogous to the previous slide, it will give you again that process ID. And then you run a command called jobs to see again what process is running in the background, and it starts to behave exactly as if you had put an ampersand at the end of it in the first place. If you want to bring it back into the foreground, and this is the same for the previous slide, press FG, that'll bring it forward again. So halting SSH, it's important to note that SSH is effectively, well it is, it's just another program, isn't it? But I can't just press Ctrl and Z to get out of SSH because again I need to run, as I mentioned in the previous slide, that escape sequence to enter tilde. And that'll bring me out of sort of the SSH context and let me type a command that'll, like for example Ctrl and Z, that'll put it into the background. That'll be suspended. I'm not necessarily bothered about that being pushed into the background, although you probably should do that. But when I want to bring this to the forefront, I can type FG. That can be quite useful if you want to free up a terminal to carry on typing locally or do something locally. So another one, pipe viewer. Pipe viewer is again not native, brew, apt-get, yum, etc. You can type PV and then a file and pipe that into something else, and that'll give you an update of how much it has actually sent through that pipe in real time. So if I'm doing a MySQL import, for example, as I am doing in this example, it'll say, you've done, you're doing 17.9 megabytes a second through that pipe, and you've done 178 megabits thus far. And that's quite useful to keep the progress on whatever's going through a pipe in MySQL, for example. There's some other process-based commands that are worth taking a look at. Probably deserve, a slide in their own right, but it's 15 minutes and that red light's flashing at me. So, talk about shortcuts. So in the previous sections, I've talked all about commands, but it's worth noting there's actually some useful things on the actual prompt that you can do. So let's look at the first one. So say you've typed a command like service MySQL restart, and initially you're getting something like permission denied. You won't get permission denied, it's actually much more verbose output, but basically you can't do it unless you're a root user or unless you're a MySQL user. But you don't want to type that out again, so you can type sudo ! What the ! Is going to do is take the previous command and effectively put it in that place. So while sudo is a good example and a good use case, it is actually much broader than that. And you can take the next command and even suffix something onto the end of it. But in this example, it just gives me the ability to run the previous command as root and successfully restart MySQL. Similarly, I want to look at the permissions of a file before I try and vim it. I see that I am the correct user, I have got the right permissions, and then I do want to vim it, rather than, because I'm lazy, type out app/etc/env.php again. It's vim ! $, going to take the last word, which is effectively the last thing that you've put on that command prompt, and make it the command itself. So you've typed a command before, it's taken you perhaps a long time to run, or it's been complex and you can't remember it. It's worth knowing that you can view your history with the command history. That's going to give you sort of an indexed list of all the previous commands that you have run before. All I need to do then is type an ! And the number listed on the left, and that's going to rerun the command with that appropriate number. More usefully than that, I think, is the command Control and R. You press Control and R, it's going to give you a prompt, and it's going to allow you to text search everything that's actually in that history. So if I had run a complex awk or a complex grep or something previously, I stopped typing grep, it'll give me the last grep I did. If I want to go further back in that history, I can keep pressing Control and R, and it's going to go further back through the things I've actually matched that string that I've typed on the command line. And finally, if you're starting to write a command that's getting a bit too long, I sometimes get a bit overambitious, and with Magento 2, you've got bin Magento setup install. I think I can type that whole thing out, and then I realise I can't type that whole thing out, and I'm like, you know what, it'd be better if I hadn't tried to write this all in one line. Control and X followed by Control and E is going to take the command you've written, that really long command you've written, and put it into a file, so you can manipulate it in that file, save it as a bash script, and then edit it later or send it or what have you. So if you want to, learn more, see where I'm sort of picking up these weird, wonderful things, you can, if you're a Mac user, you can download the Homebrew package manager that I spoke about before, and even on my Zhush, which is a sort of a command line, makes everything pretty and nice, which is good. And general Unix commands, have a look at those 2 links there. So yeah, thank you, and thank you to the people who suffered me running through this previously. So. Cheers.